Drop what you're doing because the next phase of this war won't be decided by a dramatic headline. It'll be decided by a quiet policy change, a cheap attack that forces expensive reactions, and a regime that's starting to fear its own reflection. Picture a fluorescent-lit operations room somewhere in Western Russia. A tired officer stares at a map with too many red circles: refineries, rail junctions, ammo depots, command nodes. The kind of sites that used to sit behind an invisible shield: distance, bureaucracy, and assumptions about what Ukraine wasn't allowed to hit. Then the order comes down: reposition air defenses. Not forward back, protect the rear. Protect the story. That's thread C. When a state starts defending itself from threats it once dismissed, it's admitting vulnerability without saying the word. Thread B is what forces that admission. The new strike logic: not take territory, drain systems, make a country spend $1 million interceptor on a drone that costs less than a used car. Make radar crews choose between seeing and surviving. Make logistics feel hunted. And thread A is what unlocks it. Washington's shifting posture permissions, intelligence sharing, targeting rules, the kind of changes that don't look like a weapon until you watch what they do to the other side's planning. Here's the conclusion we're driving toward. When those three threads tighten at the same time, you don't just get battlefield pressure, you get systemic panic. Next, we start in Washington, where a few sentences quietly move the front line hundreds of miles. The most dangerous moves in Washington don't arrive with marching music. They arrive as a paragraph, edited, footnoted, and read aloud like it's just another Tuesday. Imagine a secure conference room where the air feels recycled, and nobody wants to be the person who says the quiet part out loud. Not, should Ukraine win? Everyone phrases it as, how do we manage risk? The fight is over verbs: authorize, enable, coordinate, restrict. Because in this war, a single verb can redraw the rules of the map. For years, the U.S. approach has often lived inside a set of boundaries: what gets shared, what gets withheld, what targets are treated as escalatory, what systems are delivered with training wheels. Those boundaries weren't only about morality or caution. They were a form of pacing, a way to control the tempo so the conflict wouldn't jump the rails. But here's the mechanism. Boundaries don't just limit Ukraine. They also stabilize Russia's planning. If Moscow believes certain zones are effectively safer, it can stack depots closer to the border, park aircraft in familiar airfields, move fuel through predictable corridors, and concentrate air defenses where it thinks the real danger is. Assumptions become infrastructure. So when Washington shifts even slightly, those assumptions turn into liabilities. The shield isn't a shield anymore. It's a habit. And habits are what militaries build around until the day reality punishes them for it. This is why a subtle change in language from U.S. officials, less hedging, fewer caveats, a firmer tone about legitimate military targets can matter more than a new weapon system. It signals that the old guardrails are loosening. And once that signal lands, battlefield planners don't need months. They need a night. Next, we move to the strike logic itself, how a cheap swarm can force a sophisticated defense to cannibalize its own strength. The strike that changes a war doesn't have to be bigger. It just has to be smarter than the defenses built to stop it. Set the scene before dawn. A logistics route that runs like an artery: fuel trucks, repair parts, pallets of ammunition moving under the comfort of routine. Nearby, an air defense crew sits inside a cramped cabin, monitors glowing blue, coffee gone cold. Their job is simple on paper: see the threat, classify it, kill it. But modern defenses don't fail because they're weak. They fail because they're forced into impossible choices. Here's the mechanism: saturation and misdirection turn strength into waste. A defender has a limited budget of attention, radar time, missile stocks, crew stamina, decision cycles. An attacker who can create too many questions at once doesn't need to win every exchange. They only need to make the defender spend premium answers on cheap questions. So the air defense crew sees something that looks wrong: multiple contacts, inconsistent signatures, altitude changes that don't match a single aircraft. They can light up their radar and become visible to countermeasures, or they can go quiet and accept blindness. Either way, they start firing at uncertainty-expensive interceptors aimed at objects that may be decoys, and rapid cannon bursts at small targets that may not even be carrying a payload. Meanwhile, the real damage often comes from the simplest follow-on, a separate platform, arriving from a different direction, exploiting the moment when the defense is busy proving it's not asleep. This is why analysts keep calling these operations cost-effective, not because they're flashy, but because they force Russia to trade gold for gravel. And when those trades stack up, commanders do something that reveals panic. They pull defenses away from the front to protect the rear. Next, we follow what happens inside the regime when the rear stops feeling safe and trust starts to crack. If you want to know when a regime is getting nervous, don't watch the speeches. Watch the guard rotations. Picture a fenced compound on the edge of a provincial city, nothing glamorous, just concrete, floodlights, and the kind of roadblocks that turn an empty highway into a choke point. A year ago, the men at the gate would have been predictable. Regular units, routine checks, board professionalism. Now, multiple accounts suggest the posture is changing: more layers, more loyalty screening, more who answers to whom inside the same perimeter. That's not about NATO. That's about trust. Here's the mechanism. Authoritarian systems don't collapse when they run out of weapons. They wobble when the chain of loyalty becomes a question mark. When leaders start adding parallel forces units that report directly upward rather than through the normal military hierarchy, it signals fear that the first line might not hold if the pressure spikes. And the pressure is spiking in places propaganda can't easily sanitize: returning soldiers, unpaid promises, and the quiet math of household budgets. You can hear it in the small scenes. A family in a gray apartment block counting receipts at the kitchen table. A factory manager told to hit production targets without parts. A local official trying to keep fuel prices from jumping while the war keeps eating money. Analysts have noted that when wartime spending expands, something else gets squeezed: services, infrastructure, subsidies that keep daily life tolerable. That squeeze doesn't look like collapse at first. It looks like irritation. Then it looks like resentment. Then it looks like fear, especially of people who've been trained to use force. This is why reports about internal security concerns about veterans returning angry, organized, and disillusioned matter, even if you treat them cautiously. The regime's nightmare isn't just protests. It's a loss of obedience from people who know where the levers are. And here's the twist. Every extra unit guarding the rear is a unit not doing something else. Every air defense battery pulled back, every checkpoint reinforced, every resource redirected to internal stability creates a thin spot somewhere on the map. Next, we go back to the battlefield, because Ukraine's strategy isn't only to hit targets. It's to make Russia move its defenses into the wrong places at the wrong time. The trap isn't the strike. The trap is what the strike forces you to move. Picture a Russian air defense convoy rolling at night: launchers, radar vehicles, support trucks crawling away from the front and toward the interior. The headlights are dimmed. The radios are quiet. Everyone in that column knows the unspoken truth. They're no longer protecting in advance. They're protecting the feeling of safety. This is the battlefield mechanism Ukraine has been leaning into. Not break the line in one dramatic push, but create a permanent dilemma. If Russia keeps premium defenses forward, the rear becomes vulnerable. Fuel storage, rail hubs, repair yards, power infrastructure that keeps the war supplied. If Russia pulls defenses back, the front becomes thinner, less coverage, slower response, more windows for small, persistent attacks that make trenches feel exposed. Either choice costs Moscow something it can't easily replace: time, confidence, and concentration. Now zoom in on a single concrete target. A rail junction that feeds multiple directions. Not a glamorous objective, just switches, signals, warehouses, and long lines of freight cars that make a modern army move. A handful of small drones, launched from far away and flying low, don't have to destroy the whole place. They only have to force a shutdown: alarms, inspections, rerouting, delays that ripple outward. You don't need a crater. You need hesitation. Because war logistics are a rhythm game. Break the rhythm, and the army starts arriving late, hungry, and disorganized. And this is where the three threads tighten. Washington's posture affects what Ukraine can attempt. Battlefield tactics force Russia to redeploy, and internal security fear absorbs the remaining slack. The more Russia defends everything, the less it can defend anything well. Next, we follow the money, because once you start protecting refineries and rail lines, you're admitting the war is now attacking the state's bloodstream. Here's the rule regimes hate most. You can fake morale for a while, but you can't fake balance sheets forever. Walk into a grocery store in a mid-sized Russian city on an ordinary weekday. Nothing cinematic, just fluorescent lights, a tired cashier, a pensioner doing the slow math in her head before she reaches the register. She's not arguing about geopolitics. She's arguing with prices that keep creeping up while wages lag behind. And that quiet argument is where wars begin to boomerang back home. Now cut to a different room. A finance ministry briefing where the language is stability, resilience, rebalancing. It sounds confident because it has to. But the mechanism underneath is simpler. War spending crowds out everything else, and the bill arrives in slow motion. To keep a wartime economy steady, you generally need three things: predictable revenue, credible currency management, and public tolerance for pain. When any one of those cracks, leaders reach for controls, capital rules, import substitutions, forced conversions, emergency support for banks and strategic industries. Those tools can buy time. They also create distortions that grow teeth. Because when you clamp money in place, people don't stop wanting out. They just look for back doors. When you subsidize what matters to the state, you starve what matters to daily life. When you keep the currency strong by policy, you often pay for it with scarcity, corruption, and invisible inflation. And here's the detail that matters for the war. Russia's financial system isn't just funding tanks. It's funding logistics, salaries, repairs, replacement parts, and the political machine that keeps governors and elites compliant. The more money gets rerouted to the front, the more brittle the rear becomes. Which brings us to the real pressure point, the revenue stream the Kremlin can't afford to lose energy exports, and the shadowy workarounds that keep them moving. Next, we follow that pipeline and what happens when the war starts hunting the cash flow itself. If you want to see where a war becomes existential, don't look at the trenches. Look at the ships that keep the money moving. Picture a dark port at the edge of winter cranes outlined against fog, a tanker easing toward a berth with its lights kept low, paperwork that looks clean only because it's been rewritten 3 times. Everyone involved is pretending this is normal commerce. It isn't. It's a lifeline. For Russia, energy exports aren't just profit. They're oxygen. They fund salaries, subsidies, regional budgets, and the industrial machine that keeps the war supplied. And for a long time, the Kremlin relied on a simple assumption. Even if sanctions bite, oil still flows through discounts, intermediaries, and a patchwork logistics system that survives by staying just inside the gray. Now the mechanism is changing. The war is raising the cost of moving oil, not only by hitting production, but by injecting fear into the chain ports, storage, shipping routes, insurance, crew willingness, and the quiet middlemen who make the workarounds function. You don't need to sink a fleet to break it. You only need repeated disruptions that create delays, inspections, and uncertainty. Once uncertainty spreads, everyone charges more. Ship operators demand higher fees, insurers hike premiums or walk away, buyers insist on deeper discounts, and logistics schedules start slipping. Revenue doesn't collapse in a single day. It bleeds week by week until the state has to choose what to fund and what to neglect. And that choice circles back to Thread C. Regimes can survive battlefield losses longer than they can survive a shrinking paycheck. Next, we return to Washington because the moment money becomes a target, the risk calculus changes and the guardrails debate stops being theoretical. The word that scares Moscow most isn't sanctions, it's permission. In Washington, this war isn't argued with tanks on a table. It's argued with sentences in a memo: what can be shared, what can be coordinated, what counts as a legitimate target, what gets treated as escalation, and what gets treated as inevitability. Picture a late-night briefing where the mood is calm in the way storms are calm from far away. A map glows on a screen. Shipping lanes, fuel infrastructure, rail nodes, air defense umbrellas. Someone asks the question nobody likes. If the war is now hunting revenue and logistics deep behind the lines, do you keep pretending the rear is off limits, or do you admit the rear is already part of the battlefield? Here's the mechanism. Russia's strategy depends on sanctuaries, not formal ones, practical ones, places it believes are safe enough to store, repair, refuel, and command without constant disruption. When those sanctuaries feel real, Moscow can concentrate its best air defenses near the front, keep logistics predictable, and tell the public that normal life is protected. Washington's posture, especially on intelligence integration and strike boundaries, directly affects whether those sanctuaries stay psychologically intact. Even when officials keep their language careful, the signal matters. If the signal is Ukraine can defend itself broadly, Russia has to assume that any critical node might be watched, mapped, and vulnerable. That doesn't just increase damage risk. It forces reallocation. It forces caution. It forces delay. But this is also where the risk argument bites. The more effective Ukraine becomes at reaching deep, the more Moscow feels cornered. And cornered states don't just defend territory, they defend narratives, prestige, and regime survival. So Washington is balancing two clocks at once, the clock of military opportunity and the clock of escalation pressure. And the moment those clocks start ticking in sync, you get the kind of choices that can't be reversed. Next, we go back to the front, because while capitals debate verbs, commanders react with vehicles. And every battery that rolls away from the trenches leaves a gap somebody will exploit. Here's what a strategic redeployment looks like when you're the one left underneath the thinner sky. At the front, dawn doesn't arrive like a sunrise. It arrives like a checklist. Batteries charged, radios tested, eyes on the tree line. And then something subtle that only professionals notice: fewer warning calls, longer gaps between alerts. A sense that the protective umbrella that used to hover somewhere behind you has drifted away. Because when Russia drags air defenses rearward, it isn't moving a symbol. It's moving coverage. And coverage is geometry. Change the geometry, and you change what's possible. This is the mechanism Ukraine keeps trying to exploit. Make Russia play defense everywhere, and it will defend nowhere with confidence. A system designed to swat down threats near the front becomes a guard dog pacing a much larger yard. The dog doesn't get weaker, it just gets tired. It has to choose which noise matters. So Ukraine doesn't need a single breakthrough. It needs timing. It needs to probe the moment a battery leaves, the moment a radar goes dark, the moment a crew relocates and hasn't settled into a new rhythm. That's when you send the cheap pressure small drones, deceptive routes, nuisance strikes that force more relocations. Not because each hit is decisive, but because each hit pulls the defense into a constant shuffle. And the shuffle is the point. Every time Russian commanders move a battery to protect a refinery or a rail hub, they create a new vulnerability at the front. Every time they rush something back to plug that hole, they loosen the rear again. It turns into a national-scale game of whack-a-mole, and the mallet costs more than the moles. But there's a darker consequence that doesn't show up on a map. Because when soldiers on the front start noticing gaps when they feel exposed, while state TV talks about control, that's when cynicism hardens into something more dangerous: betrayal of belief. And in an authoritarian system, belief is a material. Next, we go inside the country again, where the regime's biggest fear isn't a drone. It's the moment the people with weapons stop trusting the people with microphones. The clearest sign a regime is scared isn't what it says to the outside world, it's what it quietly does to its own people. Imagine a regional administration building on a weekday morning, gray corridors, humming lights, a line of men in winter jackets waiting to sign forms. Some are there for benefits. Some are there to fix paperwork that never seems to get fixed. A clerk behind glass repeats the same sentence like a mantra. Come back next week. No shouting, just a slow accumulation of humiliation. Outside, the street has more uniforms than it used to. Not because crime exploded overnight, but because the state is reallocating attention. Multiple observers have noted a pattern in authoritarian systems under strain. They begin treating social friction like a security threat. More cameras, more checkpoints, more random inspections, more of the government's energy devoted to monitoring, not building. Here's the mechanism. When you can't raise living standards, you try to raise fear. But fear only works if the people holding the batons believe in the system more than they resent it. That's where returning soldiers become a political variable the Kremlin can't fully control. Veterans aren't automatically rebels, but they are a concentrated population with organizational bonds, combat experience, and a private memory of what reality looked like versus what television claimed it looked like. If even a minority of them come home feeling used rather than honored, the state's coercive math changes. So the regime compensates the way it always does. Parallel chains of loyalty. Forces that answer directly upward. Overlapping security responsibilities. 2 keys for 1 door. 2 uniforms at 1 gate. But every extra layer of internal control drains capability from the war effort and advertises mistrust to everyone watching. Next, we return to the big question. If Moscow starts believing its rear, its economy, and its loyalty base are all exposed at once, what option does it reach for when it feels the floor giving way? When a leadership starts acting like the walls are thin, you have to ask the question nobody likes. What does it do when it thinks time is no longer an ally? Picture the Kremlin late at night, not the public palace imagery, but the closed-door version of power. Aides moving quietly, phones lighting up and going dark. A small circle trying to read the future from incomplete information. This is the moment where regimes don't look for the best option. They look for the option that keeps them alive. Analysts tend to frame three endgames, and each one is ugly in its own way. The first is a deal, some form of freeze, pause, or negotiated arrangement. The problem isn't whether diplomats can draft language. The problem is psychological. A system that has sold the war as destiny can't easily accept an outcome that feels like retreat without risking the story that holds it together. The second is internal rupture. Not necessarily crowds in the streets, sometimes it's quieter. Elite fragmentation, regional power brokers hedging, security services competing. The slow realization that loyalty is no longer a guarantee, but a transaction. This is where Thread C becomes decisive. When the regime spends more effort policing itself than projecting strength, it starts eating its own cohesion. And the third is escalation, not because it's smart, but because cornered leaders sometimes reach for shock as a tool. If you believe the rear is exposed, the economy is bleeding, and the front is grinding, you start thinking in shorter horizons. You start thinking in gambles. Here's the mechanism. Shrinking options create a bias toward dramatic moves. Even a bluff can become a trap if the other side calls it. Next, we bring all three threads into one converging timeline: Washington's verbs, the battlefield's cost trap, and the regime's fear moving toward the same week where one misread signal could flip the entire story. Here's the convergence and why it matters more than any single strike. Thread A in Washington sets the ceiling of what Ukraine can attempt. Thread B on the battlefield turns that ceiling into pressure, forcing Russia to spend premium defenses on cheap threats. Thread C inside the regime converts that pressure into paranoia redeployments, internal security layering, economic strain, and a leadership that starts acting like it doesn't trust the ground beneath it. When these threads are separate, the system can absorb them. A policy shift here, a raid there, a security adjustment somewhere else. Painful, but manageable. When they tighten at the same time, the system stops behaving like a war machine and starts behaving like a stressed organism, protecting the wrong organs, misreading signals, burning energy just to feel safe. This is what it looks like in practice. A single successful operation forces Russia to pull air defenses back. That creates openings at the front. Ukraine probes those openings, creating more urgency. In response, Moscow diverts more resources into the rear, protecting fuel, rails, command nodes. Meanwhile, the economy absorbs the cost: higher spending, tighter controls, more household pressure. That pressure feeds resentment. Resentment forces more internal security. More internal security drains capacity again. It's a loop, and loops accelerate. Now add the final ingredient: perception. If the Kremlin concludes the rear is no longer a sanctuary, it begins to see vulnerability everywhere. If it sees vulnerability everywhere, it starts making defensive moves that look like weakness. If those moves look like weakness, they invite more pressure. That's how regimes don't just lose wars, they lose predictability. And predictability is what keeps nuclear armed states stable in a crisis. So the question isn't simply, is Russia struggling? The sharper question is, can this system remain coherent as it's forced to defend its territory, its economy, and its loyalty base all at once, while the rules of what's possible are shifting in real time? Next, we end with the only thing that truly matters now: what a panicking autocrat does when he believes the floor is already cracking, and how close the rest of the world is standing to that impact zone.